The Weight of Blood. Part 1. The Envelope. The afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains of Eleanor's living room, casting delicate shadows across the hardwood floors she'd polished every Saturday for 43 years. She sat in her favorite armchair, the one with the slightly worn armrest from her hand always rested, watching dust motes dance in the sunbeam. At 72, Eleanor Hayes had learned to find peace in small things, the way morning light hit her garden, the sound of rain on the roof, the weight of a good book in her hands. The doorbell shattered that peace. She wasn't expecting anyone. Her weekly grocery delivery wasn't until Thursday, and her neighbor Ruth usually called before stopping by. Eleanor rose slowly, her knees protesting slightly, and made her way to the front door. Through the frosted glass panel, she could make out a familiar silhouette. Tall, broad-shouldered, unmistakable. "Brandon," she said, opening the door with a smile that came automatically, the way it always did for her only child. "What a lovely surprise. Come in, sweetheart." Her son stood on the porch, his expression unreadable behind expensive sunglasses. He wore a tailored suit that probably cost more than her monthly pension, and his shoes, Italian leather she'd learned to recognize them, gleamed in the afternoon sun. At 45, Brandon Hayes looked every inch of the successful businessman he'd always wanted to be. But something in his posture made Eleanor's maternal instincts flare to life, that ancient alarm system that never quite turned off no matter how old your children grew. "Mom," he said, stepping inside without the usual kiss on her cheek. "We need to talk." Those 4 words. Eleanor had heard them before, of course, throughout Brandon's life. When he'd wrecked his first car at 17, when he'd dropped out of college after 2 semesters, when his first marriage had imploded after 18 months, when his second business venture had failed. Each time, those words had been followed by a request, sometimes for money, sometimes for bail, once for her to lie to his wife about where he'd been on a Tuesday night. She'd said yes every time. "Of course, honey," Eleanor said, closing the door behind him. "Would you like some coffee? I just made a fresh pot. This isn't a social visit." Brandon removed his sunglasses, and Eleanor saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Not shame or embarrassment, she knew those expressions well. This was something harder, colder. Determination, maybe. Or desperation wearing a mask of confidence. "All right," she said slowly, leading him into the living room. "Why don't you sit down and tell me what's wrong?" Brandon remained standing. He pulled a manila envelope from his briefcase, expensive leather monogrammed, and held it awkwardly, as if it burned his fingers. For a moment, Eleanor saw a flash of the boy he'd been, the one who'd come home at 13 with the failed math test hidden in his backpack, terrified of disappointing her. Brandon said, his voice taking on that rehearsed quality she'd heard him use during phone calls with his business partners. "I'm going to cut right to the chase, Mom. I'm in a difficult financial situation. Actually, it's more than difficult. It's critical." Eleanor sat down in her chair, her hands folding automatically in her lap. "What kind of situation?" "The kind that doesn't leave room for long explanations." He thrust the envelope toward her. "It explains everything. The numbers, the timeline, the consequences if we don't act immediately." "We." That word carried weight. Eleanor took the envelope with trembling fingers, noting the heaviness of it, the expensive paper stock. Whatever this was, it had been prepared professionally. She opened it carefully, pulling out a stack of documents thick enough to be a novel. The first page made her stomach drop. "Brandon," she whispered, her eyes scanning the numbers. This says you owe $900,000? That's right. 900,000, to be precise. Actually, with the interest and penalties, it's closer to 915,000 now, but I rounded down because $900,000? Eleanor's voice rose despite her best efforts to stay calm. "How is that even possible? What did you do?" "It's complicated." Brandon began pacing, his expensive shoes clicking against her hardwood floors. "There were investments that didn't pan out, some bad advice from people I trusted, a series of unfortunate timing issues with the real estate market. The details don't really matter at this point, Mom. What matters is fixing it." Eleanor flipped through the pages, her hands shaking. Legal documents, bank statements, court notices. The words blurred together, but certain phrases leapt out at her. Default, judgment, asset seizure, criminal prosecution. Brandon, some of these documents are from collectors, from lawyers. This one is from the district attorney's office. She looked up at him, fear replacing the initial shock. Honey, are you in legal trouble? Not if we handle this correctly. He stopped pacing and crouched down in front of her chair, taking her hands in his. His palms were clammy. Mom, I need your help. You're the only person I can turn to. Melissa won't help. She's frozen all the accounts. My partners have already jumped ship. My credit is destroyed. But you have the house. I felt something cold settle in my chest, like ice forming around my heart. Brandon, this house is all I have. You have equity, Mom. Nearly $1 million in equity. I had an appraiser look at it. The market is hot right now. This neighborhood has really come up in value. You bought this place for what, $80,000 back in the 80s? It's worth at least $1.2 million now, probably more. This is my home, Eleanor said quietly. Your father and I bought this house when we got married. You grew up here. This is where... I know the history, Mom. Brandon's voice took on an edge of impatience. But history doesn't matter if I end up in prison. Do you understand what I'm telling you? If we don't resolve this debt, I'm looking at criminal charges, fraud, embezzlement. The DA has building a case. Eleanor pulled her hands free, clutching the envelope against her chest like a shield. Embezzlement? Brandon, what did you do? I made some mistakes with company funds. I was going to pay it back. I had a plan. But the investments went south. And now the board has gotten law enforcement involved and everything's spiraling. He stood up abruptly, running his hands through his hair. But none of that matters if we can settle. They've agreed to drop everything if I pay back what I took, plus penalties. $900,000 makes this whole nightmare disappear. And you want me to give you that money? It wasn't a question. I want you to help your son. Brandon's voice softened, and there it was, the manipulation she'd fallen for 100 times before, dressed up in filial devotion. Mom, you raised me to come to family when I'm in trouble. You always said family takes care of family. Remember when Dad lost his job in '93? Your parents helped you keep this house. They didn't hesitate. That's what families do. My parents loaned us $5,000, Brandon said, her voice steady despite the emotions churning in her stomach. Not $900,000. Not my home. Times have changed. Inflation, Mom. $900,000 today is like $5,000 back then, relatively speaking. That's not how math works, Brandon. This is my life we're talking about. His composure cracked, and suddenly he was shouting, his face flushed. Do you want to visit your son in prison? Do you want that humiliation? Do you want to explain to your friends at church why your only child is behind bars? Eleanor stood up, drawing herself to her full height of 5'3". Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet but firm. Don't you dare try to shame me for your mistakes. Brandon blinked, taken aback. Eleanor rarely raised her voice, rarely contradicted him directly. For 45 years, she'd been the supportive mother, the understanding ear, the soft place to land when his schemes fell apart. She'd bailed him out of jail once, covered his rent a dozen times, co-signed loans she'd ended up paying off herself. When his first wife left him, Eleanor had let him move back home for 2 years. When his second business failed, she emptied her savings to help him avoid bankruptcy. Every time, she told herself it was the last time. Every time, he'd promised to change. Mom, I'm sorry, Brandon said, shifting tactics, his voice dropping to that pleading tone that had worked so well when he was younger. Mom, I didn't mean to yell. I'm just scared. I'm terrified. You're my mother. You're supposed to protect me. You're 45 years old. I've protected you enough. What does that mean? She looked down at the envelope in her hands, at the weight of his mistakes printed on expensive paper. $900,000. Her home. Her security. Everything she had left of the life she'd built with Thomas, her husband of 47 years, who died 3 years ago, leaving her this house and enough pension to live comfortably, if modestly. It means, she said slowly, that I need time to think about this. This is too big a decision to make right now, with you standing here pressuring me. There's no time, Brandon's voice rose again. Mom, they want a response by Monday. If I don't have a solution by Monday morning, the DA moves forward with charges. Do you understand? 5 days. I have 5 days to come up with $900,000 or my life is over.
Then maybe you should have come to me more than 5 days before the deadline. The words hung in the air between them, sharp and accusatory. Brandon's face hardened, and Eleanor saw something she'd never seen before in her son's eyes. Not just anger or frustration, but something that looked almost like hatred. You know what? Brandon snatched his briefcase from the floor. I should have known. I should have known you'd choose money over your own son. Dad was right about you. You care more about things than people. That's why he spent so much time at the office, Mom. That's why he was never home. The words struck like physical blows. Eleanor gripped the back of her chair, her knuckles white. Thomas had loved this house, had loved her. They'd had their struggles, like any couple. But to have Brandon weaponize her grief, twist her memories, get out, she whispered. What? Get out of my house. Eleanor's voice grew stronger. Take your envelope and your threats and your manipulation and get out. You're really going to let me go to prison? Brandon laughed, but it was a hollow sound. Unbelievable. My own mother. Well, when they come to take me away, when they put me in handcuffs and process me like a common criminal, I hope you sleep well in your precious house. He stormed toward the door, and Eleanor followed, her legs feeling unsteady. At the threshold, Brandon turned back one more time. You'll regret this. When I'm gone, when you're alone with nothing but your principles and your empty rooms, you'll regret not helping me when you had the chance. The door slammed, rattling the frame. Eleanor stood in the hallway, the envelope still clutched in her hands, listening to Brandon's car start up and peel away from the curb with a screech of expensive tires. Then, slowly, her legs gave out and she sank to the floor. Part 2. The Night of Doubts. Eleanor didn't know how long she sat on the hallway floor, her back against the wall, the envelope resting in her lap. The afternoon light faded to evening. Shadows growing long across the hardwood Thomas had insisted on refinishing himself the year before he died. She remembered watching him work on his hands and knees for weeks, determined to restore the original beauty of the 100-year-old oak. This house has good bones, Ellie, he'd said, wiping sweat from his forehead. We just have to respect it. Take care of it. It'll take care of us in return. Had she just chosen the house over her son? The thought made her stomach turn. Eleanor forced herself to stand, her knees protesting, and made her way to the kitchen. Her coffee sat cold on the counter. She'd made it before Brandon arrived, back when the world had seemed stable and predictable. She poured it down the sink and put the kettle on for tea instead, going through the motions automatically while her mind raced. $900,000. It wasn't just the number, though the number was staggering, impossible. It was what the number represented. Years of enabling, of saying yes when she should have said no, of bailing Brandon out instead of letting him face consequences. When he'd crashed his first car while driving drunk at 17, Eleanor had used her insurance to cover it, claimed she'd been driving. When he'd been caught cheating on his college entrance exams, she'd written a generous check to the prep school to cover damages and ensure his expulsion stayed off his permanent record. When his first business failed and angry investors came calling, Eleanor had sold her mother's jewelry to help settle debts. Every time, she told herself she was protecting her son, being a good mother. That's what mothers did, wasn't it? They protected their children. But when did protection become enabling? When did love become codependence? The kettle whistled, and Eleanor poured hot water over a chamomile tea bag, watching the color bleed into the clear water like visible comfort. She carried her cup to the kitchen table,
the same table where she'd served Brandon breakfast every morning for 18 years, and opened the envelope again. This time, she read carefully. The documents told a story of systematic theft. Brandon had been the CFO of a mid-sized tech company, and over the past 3 years, he'd been moving money from the company accounts into personal investment vehicles. Not all at once, that would have been too obvious. Small transfers at first, a few thousand here and there, disguised as legitimate business expenses, then larger amounts as his confidence grew and his need increased. According to the bank statements, Brandon had been living far beyond his means for years. A house in an exclusive gated community, monthly mortgage of $8,000, luxury cars, payments totaling $3,000 a month, private school for his 2 children, $4,000 per month, country club memberships, vacation homes, designer clothes, expensive restaurants. The numbers were dizzying. And his investments had all failed, every single one. Real estate deals that fell through, stock options that tanked, cryptocurrency that collapsed. Brandon had been gambling with stolen money, trying to win big enough to pay it all back before anyone noticed. But someone had noticed. A junior accountant, according to one document, had flagged irregularities during a routine audit. The company had launched an investigation. They'd found everything. Eleanor set down her tea with a trembling hand. This wasn't a series of unfortunate events or bad luck. This was deliberate, repeated criminal activity. Brandon hadn't made a mistake. He'd made a choice, many choices, over and over again for 3 years. And now he wanted her to fix it, with her home, with her security, with everything she had. Her phone rang, making her jump. Eleanor picked it up, expecting Brandon again, ready for another round of manipulation. But the caller ID showed a different name, Melissa Hayes, her daughter-in-law. Eleanor's finger hovered over the answer button. She and Melissa had a cordial but distant relationship. Brandon's 3rd wife. He'd been married 3 times by 45, was 20 years younger than him, a former personal trainer he'd met at the gym. Pretty, quiet, and utterly devoted to her 2 children, Jacob, 7, and Emma, 5. Eleanor had always liked Melissa, but never felt close to her, sensing the younger woman's discomfort with the Hayes family dynamics. She answered on the 4th ring. "Hello, Eleanor?" Melissa's voice was tight, controlled. "I hope I'm not calling at a bad time." "No, it's..." Eleanor trailed off. What could she say? That her son had just demanded her entire life savings and stormed out when she hesitated? "It's fine. How are the children?" "They're sleeping." "Eleanor, I need to be honest with you. I'm calling because I know Brandon was going to see you today, and I know what he was going to ask." Eleanor closed her eyes. "Did he tell you he was coming?" "No, but I've found the paperwork he had prepared. The appraisal of your house, the equity calculations, the settlement documents already drawn up." Melissa paused, and Eleanor heard a tremor in her voice. "Eleanor, please don't give him that money. I don't have that kind of money, Melissa. He wants me to mortgage my house." "I know, and I'm begging you not to do it. I've been married to Brandon for 6 years. I love him, or at least I thought I did, but Eleanor, I can't keep watching him destroy everyone around him. He's already destroyed our family. Our accounts are frozen because they're part of the investigation. My parents gave us $50,000 last year for a down payment on a vacation property. That money's gone, swallowed up in Brandon's schemes. I had to pull Jacob and Emma out of private school mid-semester. We're living in the house, but I don't know for how much longer." "I'm so sorry, Melissa." "Don't be sorry for me. Be sorry for yourself if you give him what he wants." Melissa's voice hardened. "Brandon doesn't need saving, Eleanor. He needs consequences. For the first time in his life, he needs to face the results of his actions without someone swooping in to rescue him." "He's my son," Eleanor said quietly. "He said he could go to prison." "Yes, he could. And maybe he should." The words were harsh, but Melissa's voice cracked on them. "I know how that sounds. I know I'm his wife and I'm supposed to stand by him no matter what. But I have to think about my children now. Jacob asks me why Daddy's always angry now. Emma has nightmares. And Brandon doesn't even see it. He doesn't see what he's doing to us.
All he sees is the next person who might save him. Eleanor pressed her palm against her forehead, where a headache was beginning to bloom. He said the company agreed to drop everything if he pays back what he took. That's not what they agreed to. Melissa's voice was firm. I've spoken to their attorneys. They agreed to recommend leniency if he cooperates fully and makes restitution. But that doesn't mean no consequences. It means possibly reduced charges, maybe probation instead of prison time. But criminal charges are moving forward regardless. Then why does he need the $900,000? Because Brandon thinks if he pays it back, they'll be grateful. He thinks money solves everything. That's always been his problem, Eleanor. He thinks he can buy his way out of consequences. Melissa laughed, a bitter sound. Do you know what he did last week? He came home with a new watch, a $20,000 Rolex. While our kids are eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner, and I'm trying to figure out how to pay the electricity bill, he bought a watch. Eleanor felt sick. Where is he now?
I don't know. He left this morning and hasn't been back. Probably at his attorney's office or maybe at a bar. That's where he goes lately when things get bad. He disappears, and I'm left here alone, dealing with everything. Melissa's voice dropped. Eleanor, I'm not calling to tell you what to do with your money. I'm calling to tell you that saving Brandon won't help him. It won't help him, and it definitely won't help you. Please think about that before you do something you can't undo. After they hung up, Eleanor sat in the gathering darkness of her kitchen. She didn't turn on the lights. The street lamp outside cast a yellow glow through the window, illuminating the stack of documents that represented her son's downfall. Her phone buzzed. A text message from Brandon. Mom, I'm sorry for getting angry. I'm under a lot of stress. Can we talk tomorrow? I love you. Such a simple message. Such familiar words. How many times over the years had Brandon apologized after an outburst? How many times had Eleanor accepted that apology, telling herself that he didn't mean it, that he was just going through a hard time, that things would get better? She thought about her grandson, Jacob, 7 years old, asking why Daddy was always angry. She thought about little Emma having nightmares. She thought about Melissa trying to hold everything together while her husband spent $20,000 on a watch. Eleanor thought about her own mother, who died 10 years ago at 89, sharp as a tack until the very end. The last real conversation they'd had, her mother had said something that stuck with Eleanor. You know the difference between helping and hurting? Helping builds someone up. Hurting tears them down. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is let them fall. At the time, Eleanor had nodded politely, thinking her mother didn't understand modern parenting, didn't understand how hard the world was for young people now. But sitting in her dark kitchen, looking at evidence of her son's crimes, she wondered if her mother had understood perfectly. She'd been enabling Brandon his entire life. Every time she'd bailed him out, she'd sent the message that there would always be someone to catch him, that consequences were optional, that other people's money, his investors' money, his company's money, his wife's parents' money, his mother's home, was available to cover his mistakes. When did it stop? Eleanor picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the name she was looking for, Sarah Chen, her attorney. They'd been friends since college, had stayed in touch through marriages and children and careers. Sarah had handled Thomas's will when he died, had helped Eleanor navigate the legal complexities of inheritance and estate planning. It was nearly 9 o'clock, but Eleanor pressed the call button anyway. Sarah answered on the second ring. Eleanor, is everything all right? No, Eleanor said. I need your help. Can you come over tomorrow morning? Of course. What's this about? Eleanor looked at the envelope, at the weight of her son's expectations pressing down on her through expensive paper stock. It's about my son, and it's about me finally learning to say no. Part 3. The decision. Sarah Chen arrived at Eleanor's house at 8 o'clock Saturday morning, carrying a briefcase and 2 lattes from the coffee shop down the street. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, with silver-streaked black hair cut in a severe bob and eyes that missed nothing. She'd built one of the most successful family law practices in the city by being simultaneously compassionate and ruthless, whatever the situation required. You sounded shaken last night, Sarah said, handing Eleanor a latte as she stepped into the foyer. I cleared my morning. Tell me everything. They sat in Eleanor's living room, and Eleanor told the story. Brandon's visit, the envelope, the $900,000, the demand for her house. She told about the documents, about Melissa's call, about the years of enabling and rescuing. She told her everything, and once she started talking, the words came faster, like a dam breaking. And the worst part, Eleanor said, her voice cracking, is that part of me still wants to do it. Part of me is still thinking, but he is my son. What if he really does go to prison? What if I could have prevented it? I know it's not rational, but Sarah, I can't turn off 45 years of being his mother. Sarah had been reading through the documents while Eleanor talked, her expression growing darker with each page. Now she set them down and looked at her friend with a mixture of sympathy and steel. Eleanor, can I be blunt with you? Please. Your son is a criminal, not a kid who made a mistake, not someone who got in over his head, a calculating, deliberate criminal who stole nearly $1 million from his employer over 3 years. Sarah tapped the documents. These transfers were sophisticated. He set up shell companies, falsified records, created elaborate paper trails. This took planning and execution. And now he's trying to extort his 72-year-old mother to cover it up. Extort is a strong word. Is it? Eleanor, look at this timeline. Sarah pulled out her phone and started typing. Brandon came to you 5 days before the deadline, knowing you'd need time to process, time to get emotional, time to feel guilty. He brought professionally prepared documents, including an appraisal of your house that he commissioned without your knowledge or permission. He threatened you with shame, prison, humiliation, your friends knowing. Then he attacked your memories of Thomas. This is textbook emotional manipulation. Eleanor wrapped her hands around her latte, seeking warmth. So, what do I do? You do nothing. Absolutely nothing. Sarah leaned forward. Eleanor, you're not responsible for fixing your adult son's criminal activity. You didn't steal that money. You didn't make those choices. This is not your burden to carry. But he's right about one thing. I could help. I do have equity in the house. Let me ask you something. Sarah's voice softened. If you give Brandon this money, if you mortgage your house to pay his debts, what happens in 5 years when he's in trouble again? What happens in 10 years? Will there be another envelope, another crisis, another demand? Eleanor didn't answer because they both knew the truth. There would always be another crisis with Brandon. There had been for 45 years. There's something else you need to know, Sarah continued. I did some digging this morning, called a few colleagues who work in white-collar criminal defense. The company Brandon worked for, they're not going to drop the charges just because he pays restitution. The DA is building a case that goes beyond simple embezzlement. They're looking at wire fraud, money laundering, tax evasion. Brandon didn't just steal from his company, he created an elaborate criminal enterprise. Eleanor felt the room tilt. Money laundering? He moved stolen money through multiple accounts, multiple states, probably offshore vehicles. That's federal crime territory, Eleanor. Even if you gave him $900,000 today, it wouldn't stop what's coming. It would just mean you'd be broke and he'd still be in trouble. Why didn't he tell me that? Because he's desperate, and desperate people lie. Sarah pulled out a legal pad. Here's what I recommend. First, we're going to document everything. Brandon's visit, his demands, the timeline, everything. Second, we're going to put protective measures in place on your house and assets. I'm talking about trusts, legal shields, things that make it impossible for Brandon to get to your money, even if he tries.
He wouldn't. Eleanor started, then stopped. A week ago, she would have said Brandon wouldn't steal from his employer either. She'd been wrong about what her son was capable of for a long time. Third, Sarah continued, you're going to write a letter, not to Brandon, to yourself. You're going to write down all the times you've rescued him, all the money you've given him over the years, all the consequences you've shielded him from. You need to see the pattern in writing. And then you're going to decide, once and for all, whether continuing that pattern helps him or hurts him. Eleanor nodded slowly. The idea of cataloging Brandon's failures felt cruel, but also necessary. How much had she given him over the years? She'd never added it up, never let herself look at the full picture. There's one more thing, Sarah said, her tone gentler now. I want you to think about what your life looks like if you do this. If you give Brandon your house, your security, your retirement.
You'll have nothing left, Eleanor. You'll be 72 years old with no home, no financial stability, and a son who will likely still go to prison anyway. Where will you live? How will you support yourself? And what happens when Brandon asks for more? Because he will ask for more. The questions hung in the air, unanswerable and terrifying. Eleanor had always been a practical woman, good with budgets and planning, but she'd never let herself imagine a future where she was financially destitute. The house wasn't just shelter. It was independence, dignity, the freedom to make choices. Without it, she'd be dependent on others. Maybe on Brandon and Melissa, which seemed impossible now. Maybe on Charity, which made her stomach turn. "I'm 72, Eleanor said quietly. "How many more years do I have? 10? 15? Maybe I should just—" "Don't finish that sentence." Sarah's voice was sharp. "You don't dare suggest that your remaining years are somehow less valuable, less worthy of security and comfort. Eleanor Hayes, you've spent 45 years sacrificing for your son. You've earned the right to a peaceful, stable retirement. You've earned the right to say no." Eleanor's phone buzzed. Another text from Brandon. "Mom, I'm coming over at noon. We need to finalize everything. I have the papers ready to sign. Please be ready. This is urgent. I love you." The presumption in those words made Eleanor's hands shake. He was coming over with papers to sign. He'd already decided she would do it, already moved forward as if her agreement was inevitable. Just like always, Brandon made decisions and expected everyone else to adjust. "I'll be here," Sarah said, reading Eleanor's expression. "When he comes, I'll be here as your attorney. We'll handle this together." "I don't think I can face him," Eleanor whispered. "He's my baby, Sarah. I changed his diapers. I stayed up with him when he had nightmares. I taught him to ride a bike. How do I look at him and say no?" "The same way you'd say yes, with love. Because Eleanor, saying no to this, refusing to enable his destruction, is the most loving thing you can do. You're not abandoning him. You're forcing him to finally take responsibility for his life." The hours until noon crawled by. Sarah stayed, and together they drafted documents protecting Eleanor's assets. They created a living trust that put the house beyond Brandon's reach. They reviewed Eleanor's will, making sure Brandon couldn't contest it or claim undue influence later. They built a legal fortress. And with each signature, Eleanor felt something shift inside her, fear crystallizing into resolve. At 11:30, Eleanor went upstairs to change. She put on her best dress, the navy blue one Thomas always loved, and her mother's pearl necklace. She brushed her hair and put on lipstick. If she was going to stand her ground, she was going to do it looking like the woman she wanted to be. Strong, dignified, unshakable. Sarah met her at the bottom of the stairs and smiled. "You look like you're ready for battle." "I am," Eleanor said, and she meant it. Part 4. The Confrontation.
Brandon arrived at exactly noon, pulling up in his black Mercedes that cost more than Eleanor had earned in 5 years of teaching elementary school before she retired. He climbed out wearing another expensive suit, his expressions set in what Eleanor recognized as his businessman face, confident, assertive, ready to close a deal. He had someone with him, a man in his 60s, silver-haired and carrying a leather portfolio, emerged from the passenger seat. Brandon's attorney, Eleanor assumed. She opened the door before Brandon could knock, standing in the doorway with Sarah just behind her left shoulder. "Mom?" Brandon said, faltering slightly when he saw Sarah. "I didn't know you'd have company." "Sarah is my attorney," Eleanor said calmly. "I thought it was appropriate to have legal counsel present for a legal discussion." Brandon's eyes narrowed. "This is a family matter." "It's a $900,000 matter," Sarah said pleasantly. "That requires professional guidance." Brandon's companion cleared his throat. "Perhaps we could discuss this inside. I'm Robert Matthews, Mr. Hayes' legal counsel. I'm sure we can all reach an agreement that serves everyone's interests." Eleanor stepped aside, letting them enter. They moved to the living room, arranging themselves like opposing sides in a negotiation.
Brandon and his attorney on the sofa, Eleanor and Sarah in chairs facing them. The coffee table between them might as well have been a chasm. "All right," Brandon said, pulling papers from his portfolio. "I've had everything prepared. The mortgage company has pre-approved a loan based on the house's value. We can sign today and the funds will be available by Wednesday. That gives us time to settle with the company by Friday's deadline." "We're not signing anything," Eleanor said quietly. Brandon blinked. "What?" "I said we're not signing anything. I'm not mortgaging my house." The silence that followed was heavy enough to suffocate. Brandon looked at his attorney, then back at Eleanor, his expression cycling through confusion, disbelief, and finally anger. "Mom, we talked about this. You know what's at stake." "Yes, I do. I know exactly what's at stake. I've spent the last 2 days going through those documents you left me, Brandon. I've consulted with my attorney. I've thought very carefully about what you're asking." "And?" Brandon's voice was tight. "And my answer is no." "You can't be serious." Brandon stood up, his hands clenching into fists. "Mom, I will go to prison. Do you understand that? This isn't theoretical. This is my life, my freedom, my future. How can you sit there and... Your future is your responsibility, not mine." Robert Matthews cleared his throat diplomatically. "Mrs. Hayes, perhaps you don't fully understand the severity of the situation. Your son is facing federal charges. The prosecution has a strong case. Without a significant show of good faith, specifically full restitution, the likelihood of incarceration is extremely high." "I understand perfectly, Mr. Matthews. My son committed crimes. Now he has to face consequences. I'm not going to mortgage my home to delay those consequences." "Delay?" Brandon's voice rose. "This isn't about delay. This is about fixing the problem. You can't fix this problem with money, at least not your mother's money. Mr. Hayes, I've reviewed the documents you provided. Your mother giving you $900,000 doesn't make the criminal investigation disappear. At best, it shows cooperation. At worst, it's throwing away nearly $1 million that won't change your legal situation. My attorney says, your attorney stands to make a significant fee from this transaction. I have no
Such conflict of interest. My only concern is protecting my client." Robert Matthews stiffened. "That's a serious accusation, Ms. Chen." "It's an observation. You're here facilitating a transaction where an elderly woman surrenders her only major asset to cover her adult son's embezzlement. Forgive me if I find your ethics questionable." Brandon slammed his hand on the coffee table, making everyone jump. "This is ridiculous. Mom, tell your lawyer to back off. This is between you and me. Family. Family doesn't mean I'm obligated to destroy my life to cover your mistakes." Eleanor's voice remained calm, but something in her tone made Brandon freeze. "Brandon, sit down." For a moment, he looked like he might refuse. Then slowly, he sank back onto the sofa, his jaw clenched. "I want you to listen to me," Eleanor said. "Really listen, maybe for the first time in your life. When you were 17 and you wrecked your car while driving drunk, I covered for you. I said I was driving. I paid the insurance deductible. I made sure it never went on your record." "Mom, I don't see what..." "I'm not finished." Eleanor's voice was firm. "When you were caught cheating on your entrance exams, I wrote a check for $15,000 to make the problem go away. When you dropped out of college, I continued to support you financially for 2 years while you found yourself. When your first business failed and you owed investors $80,000, I sold my mother's jewelry, pieces that had been in our family for 3 generations, to bail you out." Brandon's face was reddening, but Eleanor continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "When your second marriage ended, you moved back home and I supported you for 2 years. When your second business failed, I emptied my savings account, $35,000 that Thomas and I had saved for retirement, to keep you out of bankruptcy. When you married Melissa and needed a down payment on your house, I gave you $50,000 from Thomas's life insurance.
I didn't ask for, yes, you did. You've asked for everything, and I've given everything, over and over again, for 45 years. Eleanor's eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her voice didn't waver. Do you know how much money I've given you over the years? I sat down last night and added it up. $378,000. Nearly $400,000, Brandon. That's not counting the times I paid your rent, bought your groceries, covered your car payments, paid your legal fees. The number hung in the air, staggering in its magnitude. Brandon had gone pale. And what do you have to show for it? Eleanor continued. You're 45 years old, facing federal prison time for stealing from your employer. You have 2 children who are terrified of you. You have a wife who doesn't know if she can stay married to you. You have no savings, no integrity, and apparently no conscience about trying to manipulate your 72-year-old mother into giving you her home. That's not fair, Brandon said, but his voice had lost its force. Fair? Eleanor laughed, a bitter sound. You want to talk about fair? Is it fair that I'm sitting here at 72 years old, having to defend my right to keep my own house? Is it fair that Melissa called me in tears, begging me not to enable you anymore? Is it fair that your children are suffering because their father thinks money solves everything? Robert Matthews stood. Mrs. Hayes, I understand you're emotional, but perhaps we should take a break and reconvene when... We're not reconvening, Sarah said flatly. There's nothing to discuss. My client has made her decision. Mom, Brandon's voice cracked, and suddenly he wasn't the confident businessman anymore. He was the scared boy who'd come home with a failed test, looking for someone to fix it. Please, I'm your son. I'm your only child. You can't just abandon me. I'm not abandoning you, Eleanor said, and now the tears did fall, tracking down her cheeks. I'm releasing you. I'm releasing you from the expectation that I'll always be there to catch you. I'm releasing you from the belief that money can erase consequences. And I'm releasing myself from the guilt I've carried for 45 years, thinking that if I just gave you enough money, enough chances, enough forgiveness, you'd finally become the man I hoped you'd be. So that's it. Brandon's voice turned cold. You're going to let me rot in prison because you want to keep your house? You're going to let me face the consequences of stealing nearly $1 million from your employer. Brandon, you didn't make a mistake. You made thousands of choices over 3 years to steal money that wasn't yours. You set up shell companies. You falsified records. You lied to your wife, your children, your colleagues, and your mother. Those were your choices. The consequences are yours too. I can't believe this. Brandon stood again, his face flushed with anger. Fine. You want to be selfish? You want to choose a house over your son? Then don't expect me to be there when you're old and sick and need someone to take care of you. Don't expect me to visit. Don't expect Christmas cards or phone calls or anything else. I don't, Eleanor said simply. I don't expect anything from you anymore, Brandon. That's actually a relief. The words seemed to hit Brandon like a physical blow. His mouth opened and closed, searching for a response. When none came, he turned to his attorney. We're done here. Let's go. Robert Matthews gathered his papers, giving Eleanor a look that might have been disapproval or might have been respect. She couldn't tell. He followed Brandon to the door. At the threshold, Brandon turned back one final time. When I'm in prison, when I'm gone, you'll have your precious house. I hope it keeps you warm at night, Mom. I hope it's worth it. The door slammed for the second time in 3 days. Eleanor stood in her living room, Sarah beside her, and listened to Brandon's Mercedes roar to life and speed away. The house was silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Thomas's grandfather clock, passed down through 3 generations. Then Eleanor sat down in her chair and wept. Sarah knelt beside her, taking her hand. You did the right thing. Then why does it feel so horrible? Because you're a mother, Sarah said gently. Because you love him, even when he doesn't deserve it. But Eleanor, loving someone doesn't mean sacrificing yourself on the altar of their mistakes. You saved your life today. Maybe, eventually, you saved his too. How? Because this is the first time in 45 years that Brandon has to face real consequences. No safety net, no rescue. Maybe, just maybe, this will be the wake-up call he needs. And if it's not, Sarah squeezed Eleanor's hand. Then, at least, you'll still have your home, your security, and your dignity. Eleanor nodded, wiping her eyes. Through the window, she could see her garden. The roses Thomas had planted, the bird bath they'd picked out together, the stone path they'd laid one summer, piece by piece. This house held 50 years of memories. It held her past and her future. She'd chosen to keep it. Now, she had to live with that choice. Part 5. The Aftermath.
The next 2 weeks passed in a strange, suspended tension. Eleanor heard nothing from Brandon, no calls, no texts, no surprise visits. Part of her worried constantly, checking her phone compulsively, searching local news for any mention of arrests. Part of her felt a weird lightness, an absence of the chronic anxiety she'd carried for years, always waiting for the next crisis. Sarah had been right about the legal protections. With the house in trust, Brandon couldn't touch it even if he wanted to. Eleanor met with a financial advisor Sarah recommended, and together they mapped out her retirement finances. Without the constant drain of bailing out Brandon, Eleanor was actually quite comfortable. Her pension, Social Security, and modest savings were more than enough for her needs. You could travel, the advisor suggested. Europe, maybe? You've always wanted to see Italy. The idea seemed impossible. Eleanor hadn't taken a real vacation since Thomas died. Even before that, their trips had been modest. Weekend getaways, visits to relatives. The idea of going to Italy alone at 72 was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Maybe, she said. On Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks after Brandon's visit, Eleanor answered a knock at her door to find Melissa standing on her porch. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, wearing sweatpants and an old t-shirt. Jacob and Emma stood beside her, holding their mother's hands. Eleanor, I'm sorry to show up without calling. Can we come in? Of course. Eleanor stepped aside, ushering them into the living room. The children ran immediately to the toy box Eleanor kept in the corner, remnants of when they'd visited more regularly, before Brandon's life had started its downward spiral. Melissa sat down heavily, her hands twisting in her lap. Brandon was arrested yesterday. Federal marshals came to the house in the morning. Jacob saw them put handcuffs on his father. Eleanor's heart clenched. Oh, Melissa, I'm so sorry. Don't be. Eleanor looked up, and Eleanor saw something unexpected in her eyes. Not grief, but relief. Eleanor, I need you to know something. I'm glad you didn't give him the money. You are? I'm grateful, because if you had, Brandon would still be walking around thinking he could fix everything with money. He'd still be lying, still stealing, still destroying everyone around him. This way, at least, maybe something changes. Melissa took a shaky breath. The prosecution offered a plea deal yesterday. If Brandon cooperates fully, provides testimony about some of his business partners who were involved in money laundering, they'll recommend 5 years instead of 15. His attorney thinks he'll serve 3 with good behavior. 3 years. It seemed both impossibly long and remarkably short. Eleanor thought about Brandon in prison for 3 years, away from his children, his wife, his life. The image made her sick. How are you managing? Eleanor asked. Barely. Melissa laughed, but there was no humor in it. The house is going into foreclosure. My parents are letting us move in with them temporarily. I'm looking for work. I let my personal training certification lapse years ago, but I'm getting recertified. It's going to be hard, Eleanor. Really hard. But at least it's honest, you know? At least we're not living a lie anymore. What can I do to help? Eleanor asked. I can't give you money. I need to keep my boundaries. But I can babysit. I can help with the children. You can be their grandmother, Melissa interrupted. That's all I want. I know Brandon told you not to expect to see us anymore, but that was him talking, not me. Jacob and Emma need stability in their lives.
They need people who love them unconditionally. If you're willing, I'd like them to spend time with you. Regular time, not just holidays. Eleanor felt something warm unfold in her chest. I would love that, more than anything. There's one condition, Melissa said. No money, no bailouts. If we need help, I'll ask directly, and you can say no without guilt. And no talking to the kids about what their father did. They know he's in trouble. They know he made mistakes, but they don't need the details. Not yet. I understand. Melissa stood up, and suddenly she was hugging Eleanor, squeezing tight. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for being strong enough to say no. I know it cost you. After they left, Jacob and Emma, each with one of Eleanor's homemade cookies wrapped in a napkin, Eleanor sat in her quiet house and cried again. But these tears were different. Not grief, exactly, something more complicated. Loss and relief mixed together, mourning what could have been while accepting what was. Her phone rang. An unknown number. Eleanor almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. Mrs. Hayes? A woman's voice, professional. This is Deputy District Attorney Catherine Morrison. I'm handling your son's case. Do you have a moment to speak? Eleanor's stomach dropped. Yes. I wanted to inform you that your son has accepted a plea agreement. He'll be pleading guilty to wire fraud and conspiracy. In exchange for his cooperation, we're recommending a 5-year sentence with eligibility for parole after 3. I see. Eleanor didn't know what else to say. Mrs. Hayes, I'm calling because your son listed you as family in his intake paperwork. The sentencing hearing is scheduled for 4 weeks from now. You have the right to submit a victim impact statement if you choose. I'm not a victim of his crimes. Actually, you are. The prosecutor's voice was gentle. Your son attempted to coerce you into mortgaging your home to cover his restitution. That's attempted financial exploitation of an elderly person. It's a crime in this state. Eleanor's head spun. I don't want to press charges. You don't have to, but you can make a statement at sentencing about how his actions affected you. Or you can speak in his favor, if you prefer. The choice is entirely yours. I just wanted you to know the option exists. After hanging up, Eleanor sat with this new information. She could make a statement. She could tell the judge everything. About the decades of enabling, the $300,000, the manipulation. She could ensure Brandon received the maximum sentence. Or she could speak in his favor, plead for leniency, play the role of the grieving mother begging for mercy for her child. She did neither. Part 6. The letter. 4 weeks later, Eleanor sat in a courthouse watching her son stand before a federal judge. Brandon wore an orange jumpsuit. He'd been denied bail due to flight risk and looked smaller somehow, diminished. His attorney stood beside him, speaking about cooperation and remorse and rehabilitation. The prosecution presented the facts in stark clinical language. $923,000 stolen over 3 years, 15 separate fraudulent transfers, false documents, conspiracy with business partners who were also facing charges. The numbers were staggering, but somehow they'd become abstract to Eleanor, losing meaning through repetition. Does the defendant wish to make a statement? The judge asked. She was a black woman in her 60s, with steel gray hair and eyes that looked like they'd seen everything twice. Brandon stood, his chains rattling. Your Honor, I take full responsibility for my actions. I made terrible choices, and I hurt a lot of people. I hurt my family, my colleagues, and my company. I'm ashamed of what I did, and I want to make it right. I'm cooperating fully with the investigation, and I hope that I can eventually earn back the trust I destroyed. The words sounded rehearsed, carefully crafted by his attorney. Eleanor searched for genuine remorse in her son's face and couldn't tell if she found it. Maybe he truly was sorry. Maybe he was only sorry he'd been caught. After 45 years, she realized she actually didn't know him well enough to tell the difference.
Thank you, Mr. Hayes. The judge's voice was flat, unimpressed. I've reviewed your case thoroughly. I've read the psychiatric evaluation, the financial records, and the letters of support from your family and friends.
She paused. I've also read a letter from your mother. Brandon's head whipped around, his eyes finding Eleanor in the gallery. She met his gaze steadily. The judge continued. Mrs. Eleanor Hayes submitted a statement to the court. It's one of the most remarkable documents I've read in 30 years on the bench. With the court's permission, I'd like to read a portion of it aloud. Eleanor's heart pounded. She'd written the letter 3 weeks ago, sitting at her kitchen table for hours, trying to find the right words. She'd rewritten it a dozen times, each version saying something different. In the end, she'd written the truth. The judge adjusted her reading glasses and began reading. Your Honor, my name is Eleanor Hayes, and Brandon Hayes is my only child. I'm writing not as a victim of his crimes, though the prosecution has informed me I could claim that status. I'm writing as his mother, and I want to tell you what I've learned in the past month. For 45 years, I enabled my son. Every time he made a mistake, I fixed it. Every time he faced consequences, I shielded him. I gave him money, opportunities, and endless second chances. I did this because I loved him, and because I believed that was what good mothers did, protect their children at all costs. I was wrong. By protecting Brandon from consequences, I taught him that actions don't have lasting effects. By giving him money to solve his problems, I taught him that financial manipulation is acceptable. By making excuses for him, I taught him that he didn't need to take responsibility for his choices. I've spent the last month grieving, not for my son's imprisonment, but for the man he might have been if I'd been a better mother. If I'd been strong enough to let him fail when he was 17, or 25, or 35, maybe he wouldn't be standing in your courtroom at 45. So I'm writing to tell you that I support whatever sentence you deem appropriate. I will not plead for leniency. I will not ask you to show mercy he hasn't earned. I will tell you that I love my son, and precisely because I love him, I want him to face the full weight of his actions. If you send him to prison for 5 years, I'll be here when he gets out. If you send him for 15, I'll be here if I'm still alive. But I won't enable him anymore. I won't rescue him. I'll love him, but from a distance that allows him to grow into the man he should be. Maybe it's too late. Maybe 45 years of bad habits can't be broken. But if there's any hope for my son's redemption, it begins with accountability. Real, meaningful accountability that can't be bought or bargained away. Thank you for your time and your service. The courtroom was silent when the judge finished reading. Brandon's shoulders were shaking. Crying or rage, Eleanor couldn't tell. His attorney looked furious, probably because Eleanor's letter had undermined whatever sympathy strategy they'd planned. The judge set the letter down and looked at Brandon for a long moment. Mr. Hayes, your mother wrote one of the most honest and painful documents I've ever received. She accepts responsibility for enabling your behavior, but more importantly, she's drawing a line. She's saying no more. That takes courage most people never find. The judge paused, consulting her notes. You stole nearly $1 million. You did it systematically, deliberately, over 3 years. You showed no remorse until you were caught. Even then, your first instinct was to manipulate your elderly mother into giving you your home to cover your debts. The prosecution recommends 5 years. Your attorney argues for 3. I'm going to sentence you to 7 years in federal prison with eligibility for parole after 5. Brandon swayed, and his attorney grabbed his arm to steady him. However, the judge continued, my mother's letter proves prophetic if you truly accept accountability for your actions. I'll support early release after 5 years. But Mr. Hayes, this is your last chance. Society doesn't owe you another one. The gavel came down with a crack that seemed to echo through Eleanor's bones. 7 years. 2 more than the plea deal had promised. Eleanor walked out of the courthouse into brilliant September sunshine and felt nothing. Not relief, not grief, not vindication. Just numbness. Like she'd used up all her emotions and had nothing left. Sarah was waiting by her car. How are you holding up? I don't know, Eleanor said honestly.
Is it supposed to feel like this? Like what? Empty. Sarah pulled her into a hug. Yes, you just watched your child be sentenced to prison. Of course you feel empty. Give yourself permission to feel whatever comes. Grief, relief, anger, sadness, it's all valid. That night, Eleanor sat in her living room and finally let herself fall apart. She cried for the baby Brandon had been, the potential he'd wasted, the man he'd never become. She cried for Thomas, who died before seeing how badly things had deteriorated. She cried for Melissa and the grandchildren, trying to build a life from the wreckage of Brandon's choices. And she cried for herself, for the years she'd wasted enabling him, for the money she'd given that could have been used for so much else, for the guilt she'd carried, believing she could save him if she just tried hard enough. When the tears finally stopped, Eleanor felt lighter. Hollow, but lighter. The next morning, she called Melissa. Can the kids come over this weekend? I want to take them to the Children's Museum. They'd love that. Eleanor, I read your letter. The prosecutor sent me a copy. That must have been impossibly hard to write. It was the easiest thing I've ever done, because every word was true. Over the following months, Eleanor rebuilt her life. She saw her grandchildren every weekend, sometimes taking them to museums or parks, sometimes just baking cookies or reading stories. She watched Jacob slowly become less anxious, his laughter coming more easily. She saw Emma's nightmares fade as stability returned to her life. She reconnected with old friends, joining a book club and a watercolor painting class. She discovered she had a talent for landscapes. Nothing fancy, but good enough that her teacher suggested she enter a local art show. She started attending a support group for family members of incarcerated people. Sitting in a church basement with other mothers, fathers, spouses, and children who understood the complex mix of love and shame and anger, Eleanor found something she hadn't expected: community.
It's not your fault, a woman named Grace told her after one meeting. Grace's daughter was serving 15 years for drug trafficking. You didn't make his choices. You couldn't have prevented them. The only thing you could have done differently was set boundaries sooner, and now you have. That's all any of us can do. 6 months after Brandon's sentencing, Eleanor received a letter. It was the first communication she'd had from him since the courthouse. Dear Mom, I don't know if you'll even read this. I wouldn't blame you if you threw it away, but I needed to write it anyway. I've had a lot of time to think in here. Too much time, honestly. And I've realized something that should have been obvious. You were right. About everything. I was a terrible son. I used you. I manipulated you. I took your love and twisted it into something ugly. I convinced myself I was entitled to your help, your money, your unconditional support, no matter what I did. Your letter to the judge destroyed me. Not because it was cruel. It wasn't. Because it was honest. You said you'd been a bad mother by enabling me. But Mom, you were never a bad mother. You were a mother who loved too much and gave too freely to a son who took advantage. I'm the one who failed. And I'm the one who has to figure out how to stop failing. I've started attending AA meetings here, even though I'm not an addict, at least not to drugs or alcohol. But I'm addicted to something. Money, maybe? The rush of getting away with things? The belief that I'm smarter than everyone else. I'm trying to figure out what drove me to steal, to lie, to destroy my own life. I'm also taking classes, business ethics of all things. Kind of funny considering where I am. But I'm learning about the people I hurt. The company I worked for had to lay off employees because of the money I stole. Real people with families lost their jobs because of me. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect you to visit or write back or have anything to do with me. I just wanted you to know that your letter, painful as it was, might have been the best gift you ever gave me. Because for the first time in my life, nobody could rescue me. Nobody could fix it. I had to sit with what I'd done. I'm sorry, Mom, for everything. For the money, for the manipulation, for being such a disappointment. I'm sorry for the son I was, and for all the years you wasted trying to save me from myself. I hope you're happy.
I hope you're painting or traveling or doing whatever you always wanted to do, but couldn't because you were too busy dealing with my crises. You deserve happiness. Love, Brandon.
Eleanor read the letter 3 times, searching for signs of manipulation, hidden requests, ulterior motives. She found none. It was just a letter from her son, taking responsibility for the first time in his life. She wrote back, "Dear Brandon, I read your letter. Thank you for writing it. You're right, I did enable you for too long. But you're wrong about one thing. I wasn't a mother who loved too much. I was a mother who loved poorly. I confused protecting you from consequences with protecting you from harm, and those are very different things. I'm glad you're taking classes and going to meetings. I'm glad you're thinking about the people you hurt. That's the first step toward becoming someone different. I won't visit you in prison, not because I don't love you, but because I do. I'm holding my boundaries, and part of that means letting you do this alone. You need to learn that you can survive without me constantly rescuing you. But I'll write to you if you want me to. And when you get out, whenever that is, I'll be here. Not to give you money or fix your problems, but to love you as the man you've become, not the boy I remember. I am painting. I'm also spending time with your children. They're wonderful, by the way. Melissa is doing an incredible job raising them. They ask about you sometimes, and I tell them the truth, in age-appropriate ways, that you made mistakes and you're taking responsibility. I hope you continue to grow. I hope prison changes you in ways that freedom couldn't. And I hope, someday, we can have an honest relationship built on mutual respect, instead of manipulation and guilt. I love you. I always will. But I love myself too, now. And that makes all the difference, Mom." The correspondence became a lifeline for both of them. Brandon wrote about his classes, his therapy sessions, his slowly growing understanding of the harm he'd caused. Eleanor wrote about her painting, her grandchildren, her travels. She finally did go to Italy that spring and sent Brandon postcards from Florence and Rome. Their relationship, rebuilt through letters, was more honest than it had ever been in person. With distance and boundaries, they could finally see each other clearly. Part 8. The trial. Eleanor thought the hardest part was over. Brandon was in prison, she'd maintained her boundaries, life was moving forward. Then, 18 months after Brandon's sentencing, she received a legal summons. Victor Brendan, one of Brandon's former business partners, was suing her. Eleanor sat in Sarah's office, staring at the lawsuit in disbelief. "I don't understand. I didn't do anything wrong." According to this, Brandon claims you were unjustly enriched by Brandon's crimes. He's arguing that Brandon gave you money over the years that was actually stolen from their joint ventures. He's suing to recover those funds, with interest. "But I didn't know the money was stolen." "That may not matter. Unjust enrichment doesn't require knowledge of the crime. If you benefited from stolen money, you might be liable to repay it." Sarah set down the papers. "How much did Brandon give you over the years?" "Nothing. I gave him money, not the other way around." "Never? He never gave you gifts, never paid for repairs on your house, never—" Wait. 3 years ago, right after Thomas died, there was a problem with the roof. Brandon insisted on paying for the repairs. He said he wanted to take care of me. It was about $12,000. When was this? June 3 years ago. Eleanor pulled out her phone, checking dates, right when Brandon would have been stealing from the company. "Anything else?" "He bought me a new car 2 years ago. Said my old one wasn't safe. A Honda, nothing fancy, but it was probably $25,000. Sarah made notes. "Anything else? Trips, jewelry, household items?" Eleanor thought carefully. "He paid for my homeowner's insurance last year. Said I shouldn't have to worry about bills. That was about $3,000. And he bought me a new refrigerator when mine broke, $4,000. Oh, and he paid for Thomas's headstone. That was $8,000. Sarah was writing quickly. "So we're talking about roughly $50,000 in gifts and payments?" "Around that, yes. But Sarah, I didn't ask for any of it.
He insisted. He said he was successful and wanted to help his mother. I believe you. The problem is, Brennan is arguing that Brandon gave you these things using money that rightfully belonged to their business partnership. If Brennan can prove the money came from stolen funds, he might have a case. Eleanor felt sick. Can they take my house? Not easily, not with the trust protections we put in place. But, Eleanor, we need to be prepared for this to get ugly. Brennan is facing his own criminal charges and financial ruin. He's desperate, and desperate people are dangerous. The lawsuit consumed Eleanor's life for the next 6 months. There were depositions where Brennan's attorneys questioned her aggressively, implying she'd known about Brandon's crimes all along. There were financial audits where investigators went through every transaction in her accounts. There were newspaper articles painting her as either a victim or an accomplice, depending on the publication's agenda. Through it all, Eleanor held firm. She hadn't known. She hadn't participated. She'd been a mother accepting what seemed like generous gifts from a successful son. But you must have suspected something, Brennan's attorney pressed during one deposition. Your son gave you $50,000 in gifts over 2 years, yet he was also supposedly in financial trouble. That didn't strike you as odd? I didn't know he was in financial trouble. He hid that from everyone, including me. Whereas I knew, he was successful. The gifts seemed generous, but not impossible for someone in his position. And you never asked where the money came from? Why would I? He was my son, and he was successful. Parents generally don't interrogate their adult children about the source of gifts. Sarah had been right. It was ugly. Brandon himself testified, painting Brandon as a manipulative criminal who'd roped his innocent mother into his schemes. He claimed Brandon had used Eleanor's ignorance as a shield, funneling money through her to hide his tracks. The prosecution produced evidence that didn't support Brennan's claims. The $50,000 Eleanor had received was easily traceable to accounts Brandon controlled personally, not business funds. While the money had ultimately come from stolen sources, there was no evidence Eleanor knew that or had participated in any way. Still, Brennan pushed forward, motivated by his own legal troubles. If he could paint Brandon as the sole architect of their crimes, if he could show that Brandon had secretly enriched his family while Brennan took the fall, maybe he could reduce his own sentence. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Eleanor sat in the courtroom every day, watching her life be dissected, her relationship with her son analyzed by strangers, her choices questioned and judged. The moment that broke her came when Brennan's attorney brought up Brandon's childhood. Mrs. Hayes, you testified that you gave Brandon approximately $300,000 over his lifetime. Isn't it true that you created a pattern of financial dependency? That you taught him to expect money to solve his problems? Objection, Sarah said immediately. Relevance? I'm establishing a pattern, Your Honor. Mrs. Hayes created the conditions that led to her son's criminal behavior. The judge sustained the objection, but the damage was done. Eleanor sat rigid in her seat, feeling the weight of those words. Had she created the conditions? Had she made Brandon what he was? That night, she called Sarah. Maybe I should just settle. Give him whatever he wants. I can't keep doing this. Eleanor, you'd be admitting to something you didn't do, and you'd be rewarding Brennan for his attempted manipulation. This man is trying to use you the same way your son did.
I'm so tired, Sarah. I know, but we're close to the end. The judge is sympathetic. The evidence is on our side. Just hold on a little longer. 3 days later, the judge delivered her ruling. Having reviewed all evidence and testimony, I find that Mrs. Eleanor Hayes received gifts from her son totaling approximately $50,000. However, there is no evidence she knew these gifts were purchased with stolen funds. Mrs. Hayes was not involved in her son's criminal activities, did not benefit from them knowingly, and cannot be held liable under the theory of unjust enrichment when she had no knowledge of the unlawful source. The judge looked directly at Brennan. Mr. Brennan, this lawsuit was frivolous and appears to have been filed in bad faith. You attempted to use Mrs. Hayes as a scapegoat for crimes you and her son committed together. I'm dismissing this case with prejudice, and I'm sanctioning you and your attorneys for wasting this court's time. The gavel came down. Eleanor sat frozen, unable to process what had just happened. You won, Sarah whispered. Eleanor, you won! But it didn't feel like winning. It felt like surviving. Eleanor walked out of that courtroom feeling hollowed out, scraped clean of everything but exhaustion. Brennan caught up with her in the hallway, his attorney trying to pull him back. This isn't over. Your son destroyed my life. He destroyed everything, and you just sat back and let it happen. My son destroyed his own life, and yours too, apparently. But that's not my burden to carry, Mr. Brennan. I'm done carrying burdens that aren't mine. Security escorted Brennan away, still shouting, and Eleanor left the courthouse for what she hoped was the last time. Part 9. The Foundation. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Brennan's words. Your son destroyed my life. The rage in his voice, the desperation. He was right in a way. Brendan had destroyed lives. His own, his family's, his business partners, the employees who'd lost their jobs. But something else Brendan said had lodged in Eleanor's mind. You just sat back and let it happen. She hadn't just sat back. She'd said no. She'd drawn boundaries. She'd forced Brandon to face consequences. But was that enough? Was saying no to enabling the same as actively doing something to help? At 3 a.m, Eleanor got out of bed and went to her computer. She started researching foundations, nonprofits, organizations that helped families affected by white-collar crime. She found some resources for victims, plenty for the incarcerated, but very little for the family members left behind. For people like Melissa, trying to rebuild after a spouse's financial crimes destroyed everything. For children like Jacob and Emma, dealing with the shame and confusion of a parent in prison. For elderly people who'd been manipulated by adult children into giving up their savings or homes. By sunrise, Eleanor had filled 3 notebooks with ideas. She called Sarah at 8 a.m. I want to start a foundation. Eleanor, you just survived a lawsuit. Maybe take some time to rest before... I've rested enough. Eleanor, I've been thinking about something you said a long time ago. You said maybe saying no to Brandon would eventually save him. What if it could save others too? Over the next 6 months, Eleanor poured herself into building something new. She worked with Sarah to establish the Haven Foundation, named after the house that had become both her sanctuary and her battlefield. Its mission was to provide resources, counseling, and financial education to family members affected by a relative's financial crimes. Not just generic grief counseling, but specialized support that understood the unique challenges they faced.
I'm proud of you, she whispered. For surviving, for changing, for trying. Don't be proud yet, Brandon said. I haven't done anything. Yes, you have. You've accepted responsibility. That's harder than anything else. Over the following months, Eleanor watched Brandon navigate his new life. It wasn't smooth. There were setbacks and struggles. The job was physically demanding, and Brandon's body wasn't used to manual labor. His coworkers sometimes recognized him from news articles and treated him with suspicion. The halfway house was noisy and uncomfortable. But he persisted. He showed up for work every day. He attended therapy twice a week and his support groups religiously. He made small restitution payments, only $50 a month, but consistent. He volunteered at Eleanor's foundation on weekends, speaking to families about the perspective of someone who'd been enabled, offering insights from the other side. His talks were powerful because they were honest. My mother gave me everything. He'd tell groups of parents struggling with whether to bail out adult children. Every time she rescued me, she sent a message that consequences were optional. I don't blame her. I manipulated her expertly. But the greatest gift she ever gave me was saying no. It saved my life. 6 months after his release, Brandon had his first supervised visit with Jacob and Emma. Melissa brought them to a public park with a therapist present to facilitate. Eleanor waited in her car nearby, available if needed, but giving them space. The visit lasted an hour. When it ended, Brandon walked to Eleanor's car with red eyes but a genuine smile. How was it? Eleanor asked. Hard. Really hard. Emma cried when she saw me. Jacob wouldn't talk to me, just glared. But we sat together. We were in the same space. It's a start. It's more than a start. It's a miracle. They're so big, Mom. Emma's almost as tall as Melissa. Jacob looks like he's 16, not 12. I missed so much. Yes, you did. But you're here now. That's what matters. Visits became monthly, then bi-weekly. Slowly, carefully, Brandon rebuilt relationships with his children. It wasn't the easy affection of before. They'd lost that. But it was something more real, harder won. Jacob began to talk about school, about his friends, about his life. Emma started bringing drawings to show her father. Melissa and Brandon maintained careful distance, their relationship cordial, but bounded. They weren't reconciling, that ship had sailed. But they were co-parenting, which was its own kind of miracle. I don't hate him anymore, Melissa told Eleanor during one of their regular coffee dates. I see him trying, really trying, and I respect that, even if I can't forgive everything he did. That's enough, Eleanor said. Respect and cooperation are enough. A year after his release, Brandon got promoted at work, from general maintenance to maintenance supervisor. The pay increase was modest, only $2 an hour, but it came with respect from his employer and coworkers. They trust me, he told Eleanor, wonder in his voice. They know what I did, but they trust me anyway, because I've shown up, done the work, been honest. Trust can be rebuilt, Mom. I didn't think it could, but it can. Trust is always possible, Eleanor said. But it has to be earned, not demanded. I'm learning that. Finally, that same year, Eleanor celebrated her 78th birthday. The Haven Foundation threw her a party at their headquarters, now a full office building with 30 employees and branches in 20 cities. The foundation had helped over 5,000 families set boundaries and resist financial manipulation. Eleanor gave a speech to the gathered staff and volunteers, reflecting on the past 6 years.
When my son asked me for $900,000, I thought saying no would destroy our relationship. I thought it would make me a bad mother, a selfish person, someone who valued money over family. I was wrong about all of that. Saying no saved both of us. It saved me from financial destruction. But more importantly, it saved him from continuing a pattern that would have eventually killed him, either through suicide, addiction, or just the slow death of never becoming a real person. She looked around the room at all the faces of people who joined her mission. Every person we help through this foundation, every family we support and setting boundaries, every time we give someone permission to say no, we're potentially saving lives. We're teaching a lesson I learned far too late. Love without boundaries isn't love. It's codependence. And codependence destroys everyone it touches. After the speech, Brandon, who'd been standing in the back, at his mother's invitation, came forward. Mom, can I say something? Eleanor nodded, surprised. Brandon faced the room full of strangers, his voice shaking slightly. I'm Eleanor's son. I'm the person she had to say no to. I'm the reason this foundation exists. The room fell silent. 6 years ago, I was a criminal, demanding my elderly mother mortgage her house to cover my debts. I was manipulative, selfish, and convinced I was entitled to her help. If she'd said yes, I'd probably be dead by now, either through suicide when the money ran out anyway, or from the stress of maintaining the lie. Brandon's hands clenched and unclenched. My mother saved my life by refusing to enable me. She loved me enough to let me fall, to let me face consequences, to force me to become someone different. That's the hardest kind of love, the kind that holds firm even when it breaks your heart. He looked at Eleanor. Thank you, Mom, for being strong enough to say no, for loving me enough to let me fail, for building this foundation so other people can learn what you taught me. That sometimes the most loving thing you can do is step back and let someone stand on their own. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Epilogue. 7 years later.
Eleanor Hayes celebrated her 84th birthday surrounded by family. Her living room in the house she'd fought to keep was full of noise and laughter. Jacob, now 19 and in college, had brought his girlfriend. Emma, 17, was showing Eleanor photos from her art show at school. Melissa had remarried, and her new husband was helping in the kitchen. And Brandon was there, playing on the floor with his girlfriend's 2 young children from her previous marriage. At 56, he looked healthy and at peace. He was still working in maintenance, though he'd been promoted again to facilities manager. He'd completed his bachelor's degree through night school. He'd been making restitution payments for 13 years and had paid back about $80,000 of what he'd stolen. A small fraction, but a consistent effort. He'd also been sober from his addiction to financial manipulation for 13 years. That's how he thought of it now. An addiction. Something he had to consciously resist every day. Eleanor watched him carefully stack blocks with a 5-year-old named Marcus, praising the boy's efforts, teaching him patience. This was a different Brandon from the one who demanded her house 13 years ago. Not perfect. He still struggled with pride, with wanting more than he had, with the occasional flash of his old entitlement. But he was aware of those patterns now, and he fought them. Penny for your thoughts, Grandma? Emma appeared beside Eleanor's chair, sitting on the armrest. I'm thinking about how far we've all come, answered Eleanor honestly. Do you ever regret it, saying no to Dad? Eleanor looked at her granddaughter, this beautiful, intelligent young woman who'd survived her father's incarceration and emerged strong. Not for a single second. Saying no was the best decision I ever made. Even though it was hard, especially because it was hard. The easy choice would have been to give him the money, but the easy choice would have destroyed all of us. I hope you remember that, sweetie. When someone you love asks you to sacrifice yourself for their mistakes, even if that someone is family, even if they make you feel guilty, you have the right to say no. You have the obligation to say no. Dad talks about that in his talks. He speaks at schools sometimes about consequences and responsibility. He told me that your no was the most loving word anyone ever said to him. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. Did he really say that? All the time. He says you're his hero. Across the room, Brandon caught Eleanor's eye and smiled. Not the calculated, manipulative smile of before, but something real and warm. He mouthed, "Thank you," and Eleanor nodded.
Second, financial education. Teaching people how to protect themselves from manipulation, how to recognize red flags, how to set boundaries around money, how to rebuild credit and finances after being destroyed by a relative's crimes. Third, and most importantly, intervention services. A hotline for people who suspected they were being manipulated, with trained counselors who could help them evaluate situations and make informed decisions. Eleanor thought about how different things might have been if she'd had someone to call when Brandon first showed up with that envelope. We could have prevented so much pain, she told Sarah during one planning meeting. If I'd had someone tell me it was okay to say no, that I wasn't a bad mother for refusing to destroy my life for my son's mistakes, how much heartache could we have avoided? The foundation launched quietly, with just a small website and a single counselor working part-time. Eleanor didn't expect much. Maybe a few calls, some local interest. The response stunned her. Within a month, the hotline was receiving dozens of calls a day. People from across the country, desperate for help. Parents being pressured by adult children. Spouses discovering their partner's hidden debts. Elderly people whose relatives were trying to force them into mortgages or reverse mortgages to cover gambling debts, business failures, legal troubles. We need more counselors, the foundation's first employee told Eleanor. We're overwhelmed. Eleanor started fundraising. She wrote grant proposals, reached out to wealthy donors, told her story in interviews. The local news picked up the story. Grandmother starts foundation after refusing to enable her son's crimes. The headline made her wince, but it brought attention, and attention brought funding. Within a year, the Haven Foundation had 5 full-time employees, a robust website with resources and educational materials, support groups in 6 cities, and a 24-hour hotline. They'd helped over 300 families navigate situations similar to Eleanor's. One woman called to thank Eleanor personally. "My daughter came to me asking for $100,000 to cover business debts. I was going to give it to her. I was going to sell my house. Then I found your foundation's website. I called the hotline, and the counselor helped me understand that I'd be enabling her gambling addiction, not helping her business. I said no for the first time in my life. My daughter was furious, but she got help. Real help, not just money. She's in treatment now, and our relationship is healing. You saved my life." Stories like that sustained Eleanor through the hard moments, because there were plenty of hard moments. There were angry responses from people who thought she was heartless, who believed parents should sacrifice everything for their children. There were news commentators who debated whether she'd been right to refuse Brandon. There were anonymous letters calling her selfish, cruel, a failure as a mother. And there were letters from people in prison, not just Brandon, but others who'd read about the foundation. Some were angry, accusing her of judging them. Others were grateful, saying they wished their families had been strong enough to say no sooner. One letter stood out from a man serving 20 years for embezzlement. "Mrs. Hayes, I'm writing to tell you something nobody else will. Thank you. My mother gave me everything. Every time I got in trouble, she bailed me out. She paid my debts, covered my mistakes, made excuses for me. She died 6 months before my arrest, and I think part of her knew what I was doing. I think the stress of constantly worrying about me contributed to her heart attack. I wished she'd been like you. I wish she'd said no. Maybe if she had, I would have hit bottom sooner, gotten help sooner, avoided the worst of my crimes. Your son might hate you right now, but someday, if he's capable of real growth, he'll understand that you gave him something more valuable than money. You gave him the chance to become a better person. That's a gift my mother never gave me, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life." Eleanor kept that letter in her dresser drawer and read it whenever doubt crept in. Part 10. The Reunion. 5 years passed. The Haven Foundation thrived, expanding to 15 cities and helping thousands of families. Eleanor had become a reluctant public figure, giving talks about financial boundaries and healthy family dynamics. She'd written a book, The Cost of Enablement, A Mother's Journey to Self-Respect, that had become an unexpectedly bestseller. She was 77 now, her hair completely white, but she felt stronger than she had at 72. The foundation gave her purpose. Her grandchildren, now 12 and 10, gave her joy. Her art gave her peace. And through it all, she'd corresponded with Brandon. Their letters had become more honest over the years, digging into painful truths about their relationship, his childhood, the patterns they'd fallen into. Brandon was different in his letters, more self-aware, more humble. He'd earned his GED in prison, then an associate's degree. He was leading an AA group and a financial literacy class for other inmates. But Eleanor hadn't seen him, not once in 5 years. She'd held to her boundary. No visits until he was released. He needed to do this time without her as a crutch. Then came the parole hearing. Eleanor received notice that Brandon was eligible for early release. The hearing would determine if he'd served enough time, shown enough rehabilitation. Family members could attend and speak if they wished. Sarah drove Eleanor to the prison on a cold November morning. It was the first time Eleanor had seen the facility where Brandon had spent the last 5 years. A low-security federal prison 2 hours from the city, surrounded by chain-link fences and guard towers. Inside, the parole hearing room was small and impersonal. Brandon sat at a table with his attorney, facing a panel of 3 board members. When Eleanor walked in, his face transformed. Shock, joy, fear all flashing across his features. He looked different. Thinner, older, with gray threading through his hair, but his eyes were clearer than she'd remembered. Less of that desperate calculation, more of something she couldn't quite name. Honesty, maybe. The board members reviewed Brandon's case. The crimes, the restitution, he had been making small payments from his prison wages, symbolic amounts that would take centuries to repay what he'd stolen, but the effort mattered. His education, his clean disciplinary record,
his leadership roles within the prison community. Mr. Hayes, you've shown significant progress during your incarceration. Your coursework has been exemplary, and your fellow inmates speak highly of your mentorship. However, you committed serious crimes that devastated many people. Why should we release you early? Brandon stood, his hands shaking slightly. I don't know if you should. I don't know if I deserve early release. What I do know is that I'm not the same person who came here 5 years ago. He took a breath. When I was arrested, I was still making excuses. I blamed bad luck, bad advice, bad timing. I blamed everyone except myself. Even during my sentencing, part of me still thought I was the victim of circumstances. What changed? My mother's letter to the sentencing judge. She told the truth about me, about what I'd been, about the man I'd failed to become. And instead of getting angry, instead of fighting it, I finally heard her, really heard her. I spent 5 years thinking about that letter, about all the times my mother sacrificed for me, about the $300,000 she gave me over my lifetime, money I wasted, money I squandered, money I never appreciated, and about how my first instinct when I got caught was to take even more from her.
Brandon's voice grew stronger. I can't undo the past. I can't give back what I stole. Can't unruin the lives I destroyed. But I can become someone different. Someone who takes responsibility. Someone who understands that other people aren't resources to be exploited. And if we release you, another board member asked, what will you do? I have a job lined up. Maintenance work at a nonprofit housing development. It pays $14 an hour. I'll be living in transitional housing, sharing a room with another ex-offender. I'll continue therapy and attend financial responsibility meetings. And I'll keep making restitution payments, however small, for as long as it takes. What about your family? Brandon hesitated. I don't expect anything from them. My wife divorced me 3 years ago. I don't blame her. My children barely know me. My mother hasn't visited me once in 5 years, and I understand why. If they want a relationship with me, I'll earn it. But I'm not going to demand or expect anything. That's not who I am anymore. The board chair looked at Eleanor. Mrs. Hayes, would you like to make a statement? Eleanor stood slowly, her heart pounding. Every person in the room was watching her. Brandon's future hung in the balance, dependent partially on what she said next. Yes, I would. She walked to the front of the room, standing beside Brandon's table, but not looking at him. Not yet. 5 years ago, my son asked me to give him $900,000. He wanted me to mortgage my home to cover his debts. And I said no. That was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. Eleanor's voice was steady. People have asked me if I regret that decision. The answer is no. Not because I don't love my son. I do, desperately. But because saying no was the most loving thing I could do, for both of us. She finally looked at Brandon. When you were little, you fell off your bike once, scraped your knee badly. You cried, and I ran to pick you up, to comfort you, to make it better. And my father, your grandfather, stopped me. He said, let him get up himself. He needs to learn he can survive falling. I didn't understand then. I thought he was being cruel. But now I know he was teaching me something I failed to learn for 45 years. Helping isn't always helping. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is step back and let someone stand on their own. Eleanor's voice wavered. Brandon, I said no to you 5 years ago because I finally learned that lesson. I said no because I loved you too much to keep enabling your destruction. I said no because I wanted you to have the chance to become the man you could be, not the man you were. She paused, gathering herself. This board asked me to speak at your parole hearing. They want to know if I support your early release. My answer is this. I don't know if 5 years is enough. I don't know if 50 years would be enough to undo the harm you caused. But I know that the man standing here is different from the man who demanded my house 5 years ago. I've read your letters. I've watched you take responsibility, do the work, become humble. I've seen genuine change in your words, and I hope it reflects genuine change in your heart. So yes, I support your parole, not because I think you deserve it, but because I believe rehabilitation is possible.
And because holding on to punishment out of spite would make me just as trapped as keeping you here would make you. Eleanor stepped closer to her son, looking him directly in the eyes. If they release you, I'll be there. Not to give you money or fix your problems, but to be your mother in a healthier way, to support your growth without enabling your weaknesses, to love you with boundaries instead of blind devotion. And if you fall again, because you might, I won't catch you. I'll help you learn to catch yourself. That's the only help that actually helps. She stepped back. Thank you for letting me speak. The room was silent. Brandon was crying openly now, not bothering to hide it. Sarah squeezed Eleanor's hand. The board deliberated for 20 minutes that felt like hours. When they returned, the chair spoke directly to Brandon. Mr. Hayes, this board grants your parole, effective 30 days from today. You'll be released under strict supervision with conditions including employment, counseling, continued education, and regular restitution payments. You'll report to a parole officer weekly for the first year, then monthly. Any violation of these terms will result in immediate reincarceration. Brandon nodded, incapable of speaking. We're granting this release largely because of your mother's statement. Mrs. Hayes demonstrated something we rarely see in these hearings: honest love combined with clear boundaries. She's not asking us to free you because she's your son. She's asking us to give you the chance to prove you've changed. Don't waste it. After the hearing, Eleanor and Brandon were allowed 15 minutes together in a small visitation room. They sat across from each other, a table between them, both unsure what to say. Mom? Brandon finally managed. I don't know how to.
Don't, Eleanor interrupted gently. Don't try to find the perfect words, just be honest. Brandon nodded. I'm terrified. I'm 49 years old and I'm starting over with nothing. I'm going to be living in a halfway house, working for minimum wage, trying to figure out how to be a person again. And part of me wonders if I can do it. You can, Eleanor said. But Brandon, it's going to be hard. Harder than anything you've ever done. There will be days when you want to quit, when you want to fall back into old patterns, when you want someone to rescue you. And I need you to know right now, I won't rescue you. I'll support you, but I won't save you. I know. I don't want you to. Brandon wiped his eyes. I read your book. The whole prison read it, actually. Some guys were angry, said you were betraying me by telling our story. But Mom, I was grateful. Because you told the truth about both of us. Eleanor had written carefully about Brandon in her book, changing his name, but not the facts. She'd wrestled with whether to tell their story publicly, but ultimately decided that their truth might help others. And Brandon, in a letter, had given her permission. Thank you for the letter you wrote to the judge. It destroyed me, but it also saved me. For the first time in my life, someone told me the complete truth without trying to soften it. That was the gift I needed, even if it didn't feel like a gift at the time. It broke my heart to write it, Eleanor admitted. But Brandon, I was dying from carrying your mistakes. We both were. Something had to change. Something did change. I did. Brandon looked down at his hands. I don't expect you to believe me. I know I've said I'd change before, but this time feels different because I'm not changing to get something. I'm not changing to avoid punishment or win someone back. I'm changing because I finally saw myself clearly, and I didn't like what I saw. Eleanor reached across the table, and after a moment's hesitation, Brandon took her hand. His palm was rough from prison work, calloused in ways it had never been when he'd been a CFO wearing expensive suits. When you get out, Eleanor said, I want you to meet someone. Jacob and Emma. Your children are 12 and 10 now. They're beautiful, intelligent, kind kids. Melissa has done an incredible job raising them. I don't deserve... Stop. Eleanor squeezed his hand. Stop thinking in terms of what you deserve. Start thinking in terms of what you can become. Your children need a father. Not the father you were, but the father you might be. That's earned, Brandon, not given. I'll earn it. However long it takes, I'll earn it. Part 11. New Beginnings. Brandon was released on a Friday in December, 1 week before Christmas. Eleanor picked him up from the prison, arriving early in the morning when frost still covered the ground. He walked out carrying a paper bag with his possessions, some books, letters,
his GED certificate and college degree. He looked strange in civilian clothes, wearing donated jeans and a coat from the prison's release program. 5 years had aged him in ways that went beyond gray hair. There was a gravity to him now, a weight of hard lessons learned. They drove in silence for the first 20 minutes. Then Brandon spoke. "Thank you for coming." "Where else would I be?" Eleanor kept her eyes on the road. "You're my son." "I wasn't sure you'd want—" "Brandon, I'll always want you in my life. But it's going to be different now. Do you understand that?" "Yes." Eleanor pulled over at a rest stop. "I need to be very clear about boundaries. I've built a good life over the past 5 years. I have my foundation, my painting, my time with Jacob and Emma. I'm not going back to the way things were, where your crises consumed my life. I don't want that either." "Good. So here are my rules." Eleanor counted on her fingers. 1, I will not give you money. Not a loan, not a gift, not just until you get on your feet. If you need financial help, I'll help you find resources, social services, job training, whatever, but not my money. Understood. 2, I will not lie for you or make excuses for you. If you violate parole, if you make bad choices, if you fall back into old patterns, I won't cover for you. I'll be honest with you and with others. Okay. 3, you will respect my time and space. That means calling before visiting, accepting when I'm not available, and understanding that my life doesn't revolve around you anymore. Brandon nodded, tears in his eyes. Anything else? Yes. 4, you will get therapy. Real, regular, professional therapy to deal with whatever drove you to steal in the first place. That's non-negotiable. My parole requires it anyway, but I do it regardless. I've learned that I need help, Mom. Professional help, not just support from family. Good. Then we're going to do this differently. We're going to build a relationship based on honesty and respect, not need and obligation. And Brandon, it's going to be hard. There will be times when you're angry at me for not helping the way you want. But this is how it has to be. I know. And I'm grateful. Really, truly grateful. They drove to Brandon's transitional housing, a converted apartment building that housed 20 men recently released from prison. His room was tiny, barely big enough for a twin bed and a small desk with a shared bathroom down the hall. It was nothing like the $1 million house he'd lived in before his arrest. Brandon looked around and laughed, but it wasn't a bitter sound. Not exactly what I'm used to. Is it enough? Eleanor asked. It's perfect. It's real. It's what I need right now. Eleanor helped him unpack his few possessions, hanging his certificates on the wall, placing his books on the desk. As they worked, Brandon talked about his plans. His job started Monday, he had his first therapy appointment Wednesday, and he was scheduled to meet with his parole officer Tuesday. What about Melissa and the kids? Eleanor asked carefully. Brandon's face clouded. I don't know. Melissa was clear in her divorce paperwork. She doesn't want anything from me. The kids are in counseling, dealing with the trauma of having a father in prison. I've written to them, but I don't know if they read the letters. They read them, Eleanor said quietly. Emma keeps them in a box under her bed. Jacob pretends he doesn't care, but he asks about you sometimes. Really? Brandon's voice broke. Really? But Brandon, you can't rush this. They're healing from what you did to them. You're going to have to be patient. Let them come to you when they're ready. I'll wait forever if I have to. Brandon sat on his narrow bed, looking around his tiny room. You know what's strange? I'm happier right now in this 12 by 12 room than I ever was in my big house. Because this is real. This is honest. I don't have to pretend or lie or scheme to maintain it. That's growth, Eleanor said. It's painful growth. The best kind usually is. She stayed for an hour, helping him settle in, meeting his roommate, a 50-year-old former accountant who'd served time for fraud, now working as a cashier at a grocery store. The two men recognized something in each other, the shared experience of falling from white-collar success to basic survival. When she left, Brandon walked her to her car. Mom, can I hug you? Eleanor opened her arms and Brandon folded into them like he had when he was small. She felt how thin he was, how he shook slightly with suppressed emotion, but she also felt something else, a core of strength that hadn't been there before. Steel wrapped in vulnerability.
Later that evening, after everyone had left, Eleanor stood in her kitchen washing dishes. The house was quiet again, the way she liked it. Through the window, she could see her garden, carefully tended over 54 years now, full of roses and memories. This house, this beautiful, ordinary house that had become a battleground and then a sanctuary. She'd fought to keep it, and in keeping it, she'd kept herself. Eleanor dried her hands and walked to her desk, pulling out a leather-bound journal. She'd been keeping a journal since Brandon's arrest, documenting the journey from enabler to advocate, from codependent mother to whole person. She opened to a fresh page and wrote, "Today, I'm 84 years old. 13 years ago, I said no to my son's demand for $900,000. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. It was also the most important thing I've ever done. In refusing to sacrifice my security for his mistakes, I taught us both a lesson about real love. Love isn't saying yes to everything. Love is knowing when to say no. The Haven Foundation has helped over 20,000 families now. 20,000 people who learned that setting boundaries isn't selfish, it's survival. That enabling isn't helping, it's harming. That sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let someone face their own consequences. My son spent 5 years in prison. He lost his career, his marriage, his reputation. He's 56 years old and working in maintenance, living modestly, still paying back debts he'll probably never fully repay. But he's alive, he's healthy, he's honest, he has relationships with his children, and he's at peace with himself. And I still have my house, my independence, my dignity. I have my work with the foundation. I have real relationships built on respect rather than manipulation. I thought saying no would destroy us. Instead, it saved us." To anyone reading this who faces a similar choice, you are not responsible for fixing your adult child's mistakes. You are not obligated to destroy your life to cover their bad decisions. You are not a bad parent for setting boundaries. You are a human being with the right to security, peace, and dignity. You deserve to live your remaining years without the constant drain of someone else's crises. Saying no is an act of love for them and for yourself. Choose love. Choose boundaries. Choose yourself. It will be the hardest thing you ever do. It will also be the best thing you ever do. Eleanor closed the journal and placed it back in the drawer. Tomorrow she had a speaking engagement at a conference for family therapists. Next week, the foundation was opening 2 new branches. Her life was full of purpose, of meaning, of work that mattered. She walked through her house, turning off lights, touching the walls that had held 54 years of life. In the hallway, she paused at a photo wall, pictures spanning decades. Thomas on their wedding day, Brandon as a baby, then a boy, then a young man. Jacob and Emma at various ages, photos from Italy, from her art shows, from foundation events. And one new photo, taken just last month. Eleanor, Brandon, Melissa, Jacob, Emma, and Melissa's new husband all together at Jacob's college orientation. Everyone smiling, not the forced smiles of people pretending everything was fine, but real smiles of people who'd survived something hard and come out stronger. Eleanor touched the frame gently. This was her legacy. Not just the house or the foundation or the money she'd managed to keep, but this, a family that had broken and healed, that had learned to love each other honestly instead of destructively. Her phone buzzed. A text from Brandon. "Thank you for today, Mom. For everything. I love you." Eleanor typed back, "I love you too, sweetheart. I always have. I always will. But on my terms now, not yours. That's the difference." Brandon's response came quickly. "That's exactly as it should be. Sleep well, Mom." Eleanor climbed the stairs to her bedroom, the same bedroom she'd shared with Thomas for 47 years, the same bedroom she'd slept in alone for the past 10. She got ready for bed slowly, her bones protesting slightly,
reminders that she was 84 and time was catching up with her. But she wasn't afraid. Not of age, not of death, not of being alone, because she'd learned the most important lesson of her life. She could survive. She could stand on her own. She could say no, even when it hurt, even when it cost her, even when the whole world told her she was wrong. She'd chosen herself, and in doing so, she'd saved not just her own life, but her son's life too. That night, Eleanor dreamed of her mother, dead now for more than 2 decades. In the dream, they sat in Eleanor's garden, drinking tea in the dappled sunlight beneath the old oak tree. "You did it," her mother said, smiling. "You finally learned to let him fall." "It took me too long. I wasted so many years." "No," her mother shook her head. "You learned when you were ready to learn. That's all any of us can do. And look what you build from that lesson. A foundation that helps thousands. You turned your pain into purpose, Eleanor. That's not waste. That's transformation. I miss you, Mama." "I know, but you didn't need me in the end. You found your own strength. That's what I always wanted for you, to know your own worth, to stand in your own power. You're doing it now." Eleanor woke to sunlight streaming through her window. Birds sang in the garden. The house was quiet and peaceful, exactly as it should be. She got up and went downstairs, made her coffee, and settled into her favorite chair with a book. Thursday morning, her art class was at 10, lunch with Sarah at noon, a foundation board meeting at 3. A full day ahead, a full life stretching forward. The envelope Brandon had given her 13 years ago was long gone, the documents shredded and recycled. But the memory remained. That moment when he demanded her house, her security, her life. That moment when she'd finally found the strength to say no.
1 word, 2 letters, the weight of a lifetime of enabling shattered by a single syllable. No. It had cost her everything and nothing. It had broken her heart and healed it simultaneously. It had destroyed a relationship and rebuilt it stronger. It had been the hardest word she'd ever spoken and the most necessary. Eleanor sat in her living room, in her house, in her life that she'd fought to keep, and felt profound gratitude. Not for what she'd lost, but for what she'd gained. Herself. After 72 years of being everyone's mother, everyone's helper, everyone's rescuer, she'd finally learned to be Eleanor. Just Eleanor. Whole and complete and enough, exactly as she was. The phone rang. Eleanor glanced at the caller ID and smiled. The Haven Foundation's director, calling about tomorrow's new family intake. Someone else facing the choice Eleanor had faced. Enable or release. Rescue or respect. Codependence or love. Eleanor answered the call, ready to share her story one more time, ready to help someone else find the strength to say that magic, terrible, beautiful word. No. Because sometimes no is the most loving word in the language. Sometimes no is how you save yourself. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, no is how you save everyone. The end. The weight of blood should never be heavier than the weight of self-respect. Family is not a prison sentence. Love is not the same as sacrifice. And sometimes the bravest thing a mother can do is step back and let her child learn to stand alone. For every person who has struggled with the question of how much is too much, how far is too far, when love becomes destruction, may you find your own strength to draw that line. May you discover, as Eleanor did, that saying no is not abandonment. It is liberation. For both of you.